Namaste and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth, study of truth, and opposite of mythology, which means science of fake lie imagination or study of fake lie imagination. Today I have a very special guest, and we're talking about India's gift to the world. Let us welcome my very good friend and a very popular analyst, Abhijit Iyer Mitra.
Thanks for having me on, Adi.
Abhijit, what can you say about the greatest gift of India to the world? Because India, now numbers, Aryabhat from Bihar, and many people, they contributed a lot to the world's science and technology. Shushruta Samhita also. So what do you, according to you, is the greatest gift to the world?
For me, the greatest gift would be Hinduism, or the collective set of beliefs you call Hinduism. And I'll tell you why. We take credit for the invention of the zero, but remember the Maya had invented it independently in the Americas about 200 years before it was demonstrably invented here. So yes, our science, our mathematics was extremely advanced. But what I'd say is our sociology, our approach to governance and life, I think that was the first, very simply, because people believe the modern world and secularism comes into being after the wars of religion and the Treaty of Westphalia, which kind of determined the role of religion in the state and the contours of the nation state. If you look at the Rig Veda, it is like an early Treaty of Westphalia. Why? Because you have everything there. You have people saying, if you don't worship all the gods, you're going to go to hell. Well, not to hell. Hell isn't an Indian concept, but you're not very good people. You have people who paragraphs that abuse the gods, and finally you have atheism in there as well. So it was a fantastic collective which kind of laid the basis for Hindu life for the next 5,000 years, which is live and let live. And I think that's a very, very important lesson. Has India lived up to it completely? No, there were periods of nastiness in between, but they were never as bad as what you see in Europe and the Middle East and things like that, right? Religious violence was the exception. It was rare and far between. And it was basically this belief that you coexist, even with views that are diametrically opposite to you. Now, since then, Indian sociology might have fallen way behind, but I would still say that that is the main contribution of India to the world is Hinduism.
Many times, today is a big wind, so you'll see a lot of wind noises here. The wind is very harsh. Right? So the post-independence Indian growth has been spectacular if you calculate the entire 70 years from where India was and today where India is. But at the same time, India seems to have not learned the lessons of the past. And so do you think how much is this education and all the past glories you mentioned in one of the earlier sessions we had, where you mentioned we are living in the past, not in the future, not looking to the future. Whereas if you look at ancient India, they look to the future, not to the past. And they took lessons from the past and worked for the future. So why do you think there's a disconnect here to a large extent?
So, I don't think India's growth has been as spectacular as, say, certain other countries like China. Now, you can make the case that, Japan and Germany after the war, they were already industrialized countries and it required a bit of capital infusion and the Korean War and, the kind of production required for the Korean War that spurred on the wonder economies of Japan and Germany. And even Korea had kind of been industrialized before, but then the Russians kind of deindustrialized northern China and things like Manchukuo and things like that. So India's growth has not been as spectacular as it should have been. And therein lies the problem. An ossified, static society always keeps looking back. A dynamic society always looks ahead. Now, in India, what you had was you did not have a culture of keeping history for a very specific reason, because people didn't want you to dwell in the past. It was turned into mythology and things like that, kind of, I would say, hagiographic, but abstracted histories, rather than a documented history where you would continue to keep obsessing over the past. You look at Egypt and China, for example. Ramesses would go out of his way to, chisel out certain errant pharaohs like Akhenaten and even Tutankhamun and Horemheb would be carved out of monuments and things like that because they were deemed errant pharaohs. Hatshepsut, her name was carved out. So they had this excessive focus on history. Same in China. They wanted to perfect their histories. Now, the problem is, on one hand, this not focusing on history kind of helps you move forward. But the downside is, how do you ever learn from your mistakes? If your history lessons aren't history lessons, they're mythology lessons, how do you learn? How do you correct? Let me give you a simple example. Socialism versus capitalism. The earliest example happens within a period of 70 years in India in the Maurya Empire in about, 300 odd BC, following Alexander's invasion of India. In fact, during Alexander, just immediately after, and Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the empire, would have probably fought Alexander. He definitely fought Seleucus Nicator, who was one of Alexander's generals, and defeated him, by the way. So what happens here is, Chandragupta ran an arch-capitalist state. So if you read the Arthashastra, which is the economic treaties and the statecraft treaties of the time, it is completely amoral, not immoral, amoral. And it's all about just letting the people be. The state doesn't get involved in anything except A, the monopoly of violence, which is you can't go around killing people. Only the state will decide who to kill and who not to kill. And B, all your regulatory mechanisms like preventing monopolies, keeping a judicial system, etc., etc., etc. Anything else that you wanted to do, you had to do it yourself. Hey, you want to build a bridge? You build the bridge, you collect the tolls. It has to be free for the military, but everything else, you want to extort people and charge it, that's fine. As long as it doesn't become a monopoly and you don't prevent somebody else from illegally prevent. If you buy the land for the next 100 kilometers on either side of the river, that is legally preventing the building of a second bridge. But illegally preventing, as in somebody else buys a land just about a mile down from your bridge and decides to build a bridge there to undercut your revenue, you can't prevent him. And it worked fantastically well. And then you have his grandson Ashoka take over, and he begins wokeism. Well, 2300 BC, 2300-year-old, 300 BC wokeism. Well, 200 BC wokeism, or the version 200 BC version of wokeism 1.0, and socialism 1.0, because he's all about the big state. Okay, he calls himself the father of his people, and there needs to be the state needs to be proselytizing Buddhism to everybody else. The state needs to be giving everybody, and the state needs to poke its nose into everything and everyone and everything. And the empire collapses within his lifetime. Literally, he ends up losing quite a bit of land. You see the economic ruination happen in his own lifetime. Nobody wants to talk about it because they all talk about the Battle of Kalinga and how he converts to Buddhism. What they don't talk about is he actually converted to Buddhism 4 years before the Battle of Kalinga, and he still ended up killing 100,000 men, women, and children, which was a grave crime in India in those days. You simply did not go around sacking cities and killing people. Okay, it was like hoplite warfare. There were very strict rules. If you didn't follow the rules, it was considered a grave violation of divine laws and whatnot. So, he, and 20 years after his death, the same empire he claims to have destroyed, the Kalinga kingdom, they come and sack his capital of Patliputra. They didn't do to Patliputra what he did to their to old Bhuvaneshwar. The capital there was around Bhuvaneshwar, which is also the modern capital. But they didn't do that, and they sacked it in a, well, sack is a loaded term, but well, they came and occupied his capital. So you have these lessons out there which we now know very specifically because of archaeology, but not because of written records. There were few fragmentary written records here and there from which we could piece things together, but that's about it. So it's very, very important we understand where India is, what its faults are, because unless you understand what your faults are and speed up your economic growth and things like that, you're not going to have a future. You can't look forward to a future that you don't have.
No, the most of the Western world, and I see a big movement in the USA towards Indic cultures like yoga. Veganism is a big thing in California now. Almost 30% is veganism, is a high class movement right now. Upper class mostly is moving towards that. Who can afford it? Vegan is more expensive than regular food in USA. Now uh, the thing is which is being celebrated, and I think a lot of, like today, just morning we had a session on Gita. It's huge turnout. It's like a 15-day, and most of it is guided by non-Indian Americans. They have no connection with India. Some of them have never been to India. They are the ones turning to Bhagavad Gita. And so why do you think that is moving according to you?
I don't think it's all that big. It's significant, but it's not all that big. I think there's in India, for example, socialists are either the very rich people or the very poor people. The very rich people, because they've never had to work in their lives and they have inherited privilege, they don't know what hard work is, and they don't appreciate hard work. And then the very poor or the talentless who feel that their poverty isn't based on their own third ratedness, it's based on the entire world conspiring against them, basically absolving yourself of personal responsibility. And remember, the Gita is, when I see Indian Americans who turn woke and pro socialism and this privilege and CRT nonsense, I'm like, how the hell are you a Hindu? Because a Hindu is all about taking personal responsibility. You ultimately control your life, right? Veganism, again, we don't do veganism as much as we do vegetarianism, because cow products, not the meat of course, but yogurt, paneer, ghee, they're extremely important. You can't have a puja without ghee. The ghee is where you pour the prayer adheres to the ghee, and you pour it into the sacred fire, where it ignites, and the smoke carries up the prayer up to the heavens. The word Christ is derived from the cognate root of the word ghee, kritasta. So when you said a prayer to the ghee and applied it, anointed it on the forehead, the prayer would stick to you. It's a sticky substance, right? Like any fat, it sticks. Gritasta. And what would happen is in Greece, ultimately it became, you were no longer anointed with ghee, you were anointed with olive oil, and Gritasta becomes Christos, which is Christ, Jesus the anointed. Technically, he was Yeshua bin Yusuf, Jesus the son of Joseph. But Jesus Christos is the Greek version, Jesus the anointed. It's the same root. So we didn't do veganism as much. And I think what we need to be aware of is that not all, but a large percentage of the vegans out there are ultra woke out there. And the ultra woke affinity is actually with Islamism and jihadism. It isn't with Hinduism at all, which is very curious, because, I always find it hilarious that in Delhi Pride, you have people marching for places like Free Palestine and Free Kashmir, where homosexuals would be thrown off roofs, a la ISIS. But that is the alliance that's being created. So like I said, I don't particularly see any major motion there at all.
No, one of the things which really comes to the mind, like one of the people who came to the US, he told one of the American reporters in New York that you actually Britain he went, but then he repeated the same thing here. In Britain, he said, you looted everything from India, but you forgot one thing, which is the most valuable thing of India called Bhagavad Gita. He said in a press report.
Hmm. So the lovely thing about
This
the
was
Bhagavad
Prabhupada. This
Gita
was Prabhupada
is
who
it
said it.
requires a very
Prabhupada said it from, he's from Bengal.
uh, so the thing about the thing about the Bhagavad Gita is you need to have an extremely sophisticated mind to understand it. If you're not terribly sophisticated, you're not going to get it. And thankfully, in the colonial period, you didn't have a particularly sophisticated understanding of things. I think you'll find that the Mughals who ruled over us had a somewhat more sophisticated nuance and appreciation of it than the Brits ever did. You see that throughout history. Uh, did they loot? Yes, but remember, India grew at a higher rate during British rule than it had for the past 500-600 years under Muslim rule. So, this, I've read this sort of wealth transfer and all that hypothesis. I'm afraid I don't buy it completely, right? The British, more than extracting from India, destroyed India because there was greater relative growth in Britain. Because, see, it wasn't a capitalist policy, it was a mercantilist policy. The difference between mercantilism and capitalism is, in capitalism, if somebody is becoming higher growth, you transfer a lot of your production there. In mercantilism, you keep people poor and prevent them from industrializing so that you create a captive market where they keep buying your products, which is the exact opposite of a wealth transfer in that sense. So did wealth transfer take place? Yes, undoubtedly. There was extraction. But remember, there was also a reverse wealth. By 1910 or 1911, it was perpetually Britain subsidizing India and not the other way around, because they'd essentially destroyed any prospects of industrialization here so that we would remain a market. So again, I'm not too sure that the Brits removed as much. Very controversial opinion, but well, I mean, if I'm not going to say it, who the hell else is? But they were never very sophisticated enough to take the Gita. And that's a very good thing, because do you remember the Archimedes story? Somewhere, if you go on Twitter, you'll see me in Sicily in Archimedes' house, running around naked saying Eureka, Eureka around the. I'm not going to tell you what it's under or show you my tweet, but I did that. I went to Archimedes' house in Sicily and ran around saying Eureka, Eureka, not completely naked, but half naked. It's still fine. Do you remember how Archimedes died? It's the same story. Archimedes was doing some very complex calculations on the floor of his house. And Syracuse was being sacked by the Romans at that time because it was the end of Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, which included southern Italy. And the Roman Empire was on the rise. So the Roman soldier comes into his house and Archimedes says, you fool, don't destroy my circles. I'm calculating circles. So he's like, okay, I won't destroy your circles. He just bends over the circles and stabs Archimedes with his sword. So he didn't destroy the circles because the soldier was too stupid to get the significance of what Archimedes was doing at that point of time. It was a bit like that.
One of the things I must tell you that, when I've lived in UK and I've traveled a lot in UK. And one thing must tell you, the barbarism is ingrained in the culture. If it was not for the church, to some extent, the barbarism stopped because the church became a bigger barbarian than anyone else. And that is a history of UK everywhere. Salisbury Church, you go and you see the stories. And I was sitting on a bench and I thought, who is there? It is a grave. We are sitting on a grave, actually, somebody's grave. So the don't you think that the India, I mean, I will not quote Mahatma Gandhi because we all know what is Mahatma Gandhi, but the recent Mountbatten diaries, which are stopped in UK. Now, do you think they have more to the like the hiding the information of what happened between Jawaharlal Nehru, Mountbatten, and Mahatma Gandhi, and all these people?
Um, so I'm going to disagree with you on the barbarism bit because remember, the entire scientific revolution started out there. It's called the advantages of backwardness. The Turks were extremely uncivilized compared to the sedentary world, which is why the Turks managed to conquer so much of the Middle East. People think the history of Islam is Arab. It is not. Arabs are a footnote of Muslim history. They only account about 150 to 200 years of 1,400 years. The remaining 1,200 years are written by Turks. Same with the Mongols. The Turks became sedentary and civilized. The Mongols were extremely uncivilized at this point of time, and they conquered the entire known world at that point of time. Right? So Britain required its kind of war-torn. Remember, France was very civilized, and yet it was Britain that kind of won the early parts of the Hundred Years' War. Every Westerner knows the Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Agincourt and things like that. And it was kind of that backwardness that always helped Britain be militarily more successful. Because societies under a resource crunch are much more resource efficient than societies that are not under a resource crunch or that are not desperate in that sense. As for the Mountbatten letters, where we all know what happened, they can keep holding it back, not letting it out, because remember, the most important letters still remain with the Gandhi family. They're with Sonia Gandhi, apparently, which she will never allow us access to, but she'll also never destroy because they're a part of history. So I think there's enough circumstantial evidence to suggest what happened. You don't really need much of the letters to kind of piece together the jigsaw, do you?
So, given now, since you have to go, given what has happened, do you think what can be the biggest gift of India to the world for future, and from now and for future?
Economic growth. I think we really need to shut up and get our game in order. The problem with India right now is we keep going around giving speeches to everyone who listen. And it's a bit like a beggar walking up to Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is dead. Who's the current living guy? Elon Musk. And giving him lessons on how to run his business. So India preaching to the world is like a beggar preaching on financial things to Elon Musk. If India wants to be taken seriously, it needs to embark on economic growth. You can't do that with the kind of socialist shit we've had for the last 70 years. And this government is even more socialist than the communists have been. So all of that needs to end. We need to stop giving speeches and blithering and blumbling. And we need to actually get our house in order and start doing.
No, great point. And because I think this is what we can give to the world. Do you think the Arthashastra, which is the India's economic treatise, can help in this direction?
Yes, because the Arthashastra is the great granddaddy of capitalism, just like Ashoka is the great granddaddy of socialism. And like every socialist quack, he collapsed. And like every capitalist genius, Chanakya created a society out of thin air. Right? Every time you talk about the failures of socialism, they'll constantly point to the four Scandinavian countries: Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. What they will never talk about, it's basically economic cluelessness that leads them to point to. Those are the only four countries apparently where socialism was done right. Anywhere else, you point to Venezuela, you point to anybody else, they'll say, oh, that wasn't real socialism. Scandinavia's real socialism. Well, ding dong, guess what? The only reason Norway is rich today is because of North Sea oil. Otherwise, they were a backwater. The Swedes were happy to give them their independence. They were like, you are such a backwater, we don't want you. You're a drain on our resource. Have you ever heard of a country forcibly shoving down independence down somebody's throat? That is what the Swedes have to do. Do you know how many people died in the in the Norwegian independence movement?
I don't know.
10 or 15. 10 or 15. Their Norwegian independence is the biggest joke in a 23,000-kilometer radius. Okay, Sweden. It started public spending very early. It was on the verge of bankruptcy twice, where their spending had become too much. And guess what happened? They got two, not one, they got two Hail Marys. They got World War One and they got World War Two, where they were selling iron and steel, they were selling ammunition, they were selling in the Second World War, they were selling the Bofors 40 gun to both sides and making a killing. So World War II came to their rescue. With Finland, it was something called the Finnish Shipping Cluster, which was supplying Western-style ships to the USSR and the Eastern Bloc countries. So, it was the Cold War, like the two world wars came to Sweden's rescue. The Cold War came to Finland's rescue. And then you have Denmark, which was, again, it became rich entirely based on the World War, because that is where the supply for pork and, all the supply shortages everywhere, Denmark was able to supply pork. It literally got rich on the basis of pork. It's still one of the biggest producers of pork. I think it's the biggest producer of pork, I think, if I'm not mistaken, right now, even today. So, this socialism fantasy that people have, it doesn't work.
No, very well put. I think the Arthashastra is definitely the future for the world, because I think the US is running out of ideas. And most of the Western world are running out of ideas. So they begin to tax their own citizens exorbitantly high.
Not France. I think France is the future. I think America's decline, it's already in steep decline. You remember, Adi, I told you this, and I think if you go to some from it before I knew you also, if you go to my earliest podcast from about 7-8 years back, I went on telling people China will not finish off America. America will finish off America.
That's right.
And America today is its own worst enemy.
True. And the tax rate in California today is 67.4%. Total.
Enjoy yourselves. All of you Californians, you're getting exactly what you deserve. I wish you get a 95% tax rate.
I mean, don't wish like that. Okay, the last question, since you have one more point, is it come from the audience, is that what can India do, because yoga is so popular, and what can India do to help the yoga community in the USA, which is almost 65 million people?
Right. So the most important thing is to codify the first principles. See, everybody tells you should do this asana, that asana, whatever. Nobody's telling you why are you doing these asanas. These were all very carefully thought out. They were very sequential and things like that. And the problem is you have a lot of pop teachers who do all this pop yoga. And, I was shocked when I was working in Australia. There was something called yoga lattes. It was yoga and Pilates. And I'm thinking, what the fuck is that? Right? These things aren't meant to be mixed and matched. Yoga is a whole way of life. There's exercises, there's a diet, there's a whole system of things that goes with it. And I think the first step has begun ever since this government started popularizing Yoga Day. But I think we really need to go back to the roots and start understanding the first principles rather than making it a fad. It can't become a fad. Many things that come out of India end up becoming fads.
No, it's almost a $650 billion industry in the US. People have become millionaires by teaching yoga, but there is no. If the Indian government can claim, because India very proudly says we never claim yoga as our own heritage, it belongs to the world, is a gift to the world.
Look, don't expect anything from this government till India's per capita income reaches about 20,000. See, it's a barometer. When India's per capita income reaches about $20,000 per capita, you'll know you have a government that actually takes things seriously. Right now, you have a Punch and Judy show, or to use that's the old British usage. What is the correct American usage? Beavis and Butthead. Do you remember Beavis and Butthead? The Indian government for the last 70 years has been a Beavis and Butthead jerk-off. So don't look forward to anything from India. You do it yourself. India at best will give you some words of appreciation here and there, and that's about it.
Thank you so much, Abhijit, for your time. And viewers always love your talks on this channel, and many Americans, mostly Americans, love your talk. So thank you so much, and all the viewers who are watching, do comment and let us know your feedback. Namaste.
Thanks, guys. See ya. Tata. Bye.